Welcome to Sweet Dreams Storytelling, where we unwind, relax, and drift into dreamland. I'm your host, Mike, and I'm so glad you're joining me tonight. Let's get cozy and settle in. Story for this evening is our adaptation of a beautiful novel by L.M. Montgomery, Rainbow Valley. Chapter 1: The Blythe Family at Ingleside. The house called Ingleside stood proudly on the crest of a red hill overlooking the shining waters of the Four Winds Harbor. It was a house full of light and laughter, its tall chimneys sending gentle smoke signals into the blue sky, its gabled windows winking with sunlight. Roses clambered over its stone walls, and the scent of lavender and lilac was always in the air during the spring. But it was not the house itself that made Ingleside remarkable. It was the people who filled it. Anne Blythe, once Anne Shirley of Green Gables, now wife to Dr. Gilbert Blythe, was still possessed of the same dreamy eyes and auburn hair, though faint silver threads had begun to shine in her braids. She had traded daydreams of romance and ambition for a real life filled with warm hugs, gentle reprimands, and the cherished chaos of 6 children. Her husband Gilbert, now the trusted and beloved doctor of Glen St. Mary, carried his responsibilities with quiet competence and a ready smile. Though busier than ever, he made time each evening to be with his children, hear their adventures, and offer wisdom that they sometimes understood only years later. The Blythe children were as varied as spring wildflowers. Jem, the eldest, had his father's firm jaw and his mother's quick imagination. 11 years old and already longing to be a soldier, Jem led his siblings with a mix of mischief and a sense of justice. Walter, the dreamer, spent hours in the orchard with a notebook and a faraway look in his dark eyes. He was gentle, poetic, and often misunderstood, even by his siblings. Nan and Dear, the twins, were mirror images in appearance but different in soul. Nan was bold, curious, and often found up a tree or leading a game of pirates. Di was gentler, more inclined to write plays and arrange flowers in secret nooks of the garden. Shirley, still small and somewhat in the background, followed his older siblings with quiet adoration. And then there was Rilla, the baby, full of dimples and demands, a lively presence in any room, bringing giggles and trouble in equal measure. The Blythe children had inherited not only Anne's love of beauty and imagination, but also a sense of wonder for the natural world. They knew every hidden path in the woods, every cluster of spring violets, every climbing vine along the fences, and their favorite place in all the world, more beloved even than the orchard or the shore, was Rainbow Valley. Rainbow Valley wasn't on the map. It was a secret place, nestled behind the manse, where the church minister lived. A tangle of trees opened into a hollow, where a clear brook babbled through mossy rocks. There were rainbow-like arches of flowers in summer, and in spring the air shimmered with birdsong and new leaves. It was not owned, yet it belonged to them. The valley had gotten its name, as most magical places do, by accident and poetry. One evening, after a sun shower, a radiant rainbow had arched across the sky and seemed to drop directly into the little glade. Walter had solemnly declared it Rainbow Valley, and the name stuck as naturally as moss to stone. It was here that the Blythe children held their meetings, planned their stories, and lived out their games. Walter, particularly, found refuge there. In Rainbow Valley, he was not the soft-hearted boy, mocked for being too quiet or too fond of words. He was a prince, a poet, a prophet. Jem became a gallant knight, or the commander of an army. Nan ruled as queen, and Dee wove spells in leafy bowers. Shirley was their squire, and even baby Rilla had been crowned princess on more than one occasion. That spring, the valley was more beautiful than ever. The grass was tall and green, peppered with dandelions. Birds flitted from branch to branch, calling out secrets to the children who knew how to listen. The brook gurgled merrily, carrying its tiny leaf boats to unknown destinies. Anne watched her children from the kitchen window, with a mixture of pride and longing. She loved their joy, their innocence, but she also sensed that these golden days would not last forever. Childhood, after all, is like the valley itself, bright, hidden, and all too quickly passed through. There was something else stirring in the wind that spring, something new. The manse next door, long empty and silent, was about to receive new tenants. Anne had heard from Miss Cornelia that the new minister, Mr. John Meredith, was a widower with 4 children. Half wild, they say, Miss Cornelia had sniffed, left to their own devices since their mother died. Poor things. Anne had felt a twinge of curiosity and concern. Her own children were fortunate. They had love, books, laughter, and guidance. What would it mean for these new children to arrive without a mother, to try and make a home in the shadow of Rainbow Valley? She said nothing to her own little brood, who were still caught in the spell of springtime and secret kingdoms. But in her heart, she wondered what changes the coming season might bring, not just for the new family next door, but for her own. And so the story began, not with a bang or a sudden event, but with the quiet unfolding of life in Ingleside, with children growing like wildflowers, and the winds of Glen St. Mary whispering the promise of friendship, mischief, and change. Chapter 2. The Arrival of the Merediths. The manse, long quiet and overgrown, stirred with the unmistakable signs of new life. On a breezy Monday morning in May, the village of Glen St. Mary looked on with both curiosity and judgment as a horse-drawn cart rolled slowly up the overgrown drive. It carried trunks, baskets, a battered birdcage, and a tumble of limbs and voices that belonged unmistakably to children. They were the Merediths, children of the Reverend John Meredith, the new Presbyterian minister. The manse had stood vacant for months after the last minister moved away, and ivy had begun to claim the porch, creeping over the eaves like a ghost laying claim to the past. Now, with the clatter of trunks and the shouting of young voices, it woke from its slumber. From her perch in the hedge, Faith Meredith leapt down barefoot onto the driveway, a curtain of dark curls swinging in her eyes. She was 11 and ran like a colt, all elbows and knees, with eyes that shone too brightly for a girl expected to be ministerial. Her younger sister Una, quiet and watchful, stood behind her with a gentle expression, her pale hands still gripping the handle of a worn valise. Carl, 9, wandered off to examine a beetle crawling on the gatepost, his pockets already full of stones, feathers, and broken marbles. Jerry, the eldest at 12, climbed down from the cart with an air of resigned authority, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, prepared to carry burdens for a household that had no one else to do so. Their father stood on the steps of the manse, tall, thin, absent-minded. His spectacles caught the sun as he looked around vaguely, as if seeing both the crumbling house and some inward vision at once. Reverend Meredith was a kind man, a thoughtful man, but not a practical one. He lived mostly in books and sermons, his heart in heaven and his feet daily on earth. He loved his children, but had little idea how to guide them beyond reminding them to say their prayers. As they entered the manse, it became painfully clear that the place had not been prepared for comfort. The air inside was stale with dust and neglect. Windows creaked in their frames, and the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway hung in curling sheets. The children set about making the best of it, dragging trunks into rooms, opening windows, swatting at cobwebs. The kitchen was the worst of it. A single soot-blackened kettle sat on the cold stove, and the pantry held nothing but a cracked jar of pickles. Still, Faith declared cheerfully, "We shall have grand adventures here," and set to sweeping, as if she'd just inherited a castle. "Where sips the cat?" asked Carl, his gaze sweeping the corners for signs of a resident feline. "Every manse should have a cat." "It has bats," Una offered, nodding toward the dark rafters overhead. They laughed then, real and free, as only children can when facing hardship together. Outside, curious eyes watched. Miss Cornelia Bryant, who knew every birth, death, scandal, and oddity in Glen St. Mary since the year of Confederation, was already informing Anne Blythe over tea that the new minister had arrived with a flock of ragamuffins and no housekeeper to speak of. Anne said nothing at first. She stood at the window, her teacup cradled in both hands, watching the new arrivals. The Blythe children clustered on the porch had also taken notice. "Look," whispered Dare, "there are children." Jem leaned forward, intrigued. 4 of them, and no grown-up woman, just the minister. "Do you think they'll go to school?" asked Nan, already imagining their arrival in her classroom. Walter said nothing but kept his gaze fixed on the girl with the wild black curls, who had scrambled up onto the manse gate and now surveyed the world like a queen reclaiming her kingdom. "Do you think they'll come to Rainbow Valley?" Shirley asked, wide-eyed. "Rainbow Valley is ours," said Jem with an edge of warning, though without conviction. Somehow he already sensed that things were about to change. Inside the manse, Reverend Meredith was unpacking his books while Faith and Jerry argued amiably over who would sleep in which attic room. Una wandered into the garden, which was more weed than flower, and sat on the edge of a dry bird bath, fingering the edge of her skirt and wondering, not for the first time, how much she missed her mother. Her mother had been gentle and fair and full of laughter. Una could still remember the softness of her touch and the scent of violets on her handkerchief, but she was gone before Una was old enough to understand what death meant. What remained were bits of memory and Faith's fierce refusal to let them feel sorry for themselves. They didn't talk about grief much in the manse, they just carried on. They made tea from boiled dandelions when the cupboard was bare, they stitched their own buttons, they scraped dinners together from what neighbors brought or what the earth offered, and in between the struggle, they told stories, made each other laugh, and watched the stars like they were old friends. The Blythes, for their part, were already curious enough to propose a walk by the manse the next afternoon. Anne, with a knowing smile, made sure Rilla was clean and the twins presentable before they set out. If friendships were going to blossom, and Anne strongly suspected they were, it would not do to begin them in disgrace. The Meredith children, meanwhile, had discovered a narrow path behind their garden, winding down into the woods. The path led them to a secret place filled with light and silence, a valley wrapped in trees and whispering leaves, with a brook that sang as it slipped over stones. "Faith," whispered Una, eyes wide, "it's a magic place." "I found it first," Carl insisted, lifting a toad reverently from a mossy stone. "We should name it something." Faith turned slowly, hands on hips, her curls blowing in the wind. "It already has a name," she said with certainty. "I can feel it." The brook laughed beneath the trees, and somewhere, far above, a rainbow shimmered in the sky, though no rain had fallen. Chapter 3. A Curious Friendship Begins. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the Blythe and Meredith children first truly met, not merely glimpsed across gardens or peered at through parted curtains, but stood face to face, eye to eye, in the heart of Rainbow Valley. The Blythe children had set out with the vague purpose of exploring, which in practice often meant ending up wherever their feet led them. This time, they found themselves tumbling down the familiar path that skirted the manse and wound its way through trees like a ribbon of secrets. Walter had brought a notebook, now on a skipping rope, and Jem a piece of string with designs on a rabbit trap. Rilla, having been left behind with Susan Baker due to her recent habit of throwing herself dramatically into puddles, was not present to witness the fateful meeting. Rainbow Valley was sun-dappled and still, except for the brook, which burbled as though it were rehearsing for a concert. The children pushed through ferns and brush, expecting solitude, but they were not alone. A flash of movement caught Diba's eye, something dark darting behind a birch tree. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "It's probably a rabbit," Walter said, though he sounded less certain than usual. Jem crept forward like a scout, parting the ferns with his stick, and then stopped abruptly. He was face to face with a girl. She stood tall for her age, sun-kissed and barefoot, with defiant black curls and a nose covered in freckles. Her dress was torn at the hem, and her arms were smudged with dirt, but she held herself like a heroine from a novel, brave, and not the least bit embarrassed. Behind her stood Una, clutching a battered doll, and Carl holding what appeared to be a snake in a jam jar. "I knew this place wasn't ours," Faith Meredith declared, tilting her chin upward. "It is ours," Jem returned, crossing his arms. "We played here since before you even moved in." "Then we share it," Faith said firmly, "because we found it too, and there's nowhere else like it." There was a silence, then Carl stepped forward, holding up the jar. "This is Krusty," he said solemnly. "He a garter snake. He likes the sun." The Blythes regarded Krusty with mixed expressions of awe and disgust. "He's perfectly harmless," Carl added, as Una edged nervously behind her sister. Nan stepped forward next. "You live at the manse, don't you? We saw you moving in." Faith nodded. "I sipped more Faith. That sips Anna, Carl and Jerry. Sips not here because he sips trying to fix the chimney. Our father is the minister. He sips nice, but he forgets to cook dinner." There was something disarming about the way she said it, with equal parts pride and resignation. "We stuck their Blythes," Dee said quickly. "Jem, Walter, Nan, Dee, that sips me, and Shirley sips, probably with Susan, and Rilla sips the baby. She pulls my hair when I hold her." Another silence, and then, like melting ice, they all laughed. Faith and Nan fell into conversation at once, discussing the best way to climb trees without ripping one's dress. while Walter and Una quietly stepped aside to admire a patch of violets growing near the brook. Jem and Carl eyed each other cautiously before deciding to collaborate on a toad habitat made of stones and twigs. Carl shared that he once kept a caterpillar in his pocket for 3 days before it mysteriously vanished, to which Jem solemnly replied that he had once mistaken a dead beetle for a raisin. From that moment on, they were friends. The afternoon passed in that golden way only childhood afternoons can, measured not by time but by stories told, discoveries made, and the sense that something important had happened. Together, they declared Rainbow Valley a shared kingdom to be protected and cherished, with rules that included no grown-ups unless absolutely necessary, no cruelty to animals, even beetles, and full freedom to imagine, create, and explore. Faith immediately declared herself a knight-errant, with a stick for a sword and a flower crown made by Diffie. Walter, though shy, recited a poem about the wind in the valley that made Una's eyes shine. Nun began building a fort out of stones, while Carl constructed a very dubious-looking trap for frogs. As the sun began to tilt westward, casting long shadows through the trees, the sound of a distant bell from Ingleside floated through the air. "That's Sis, Susan's sis, call to supper," Jem said reluctantly. "If we sit late again, she sit give us cold potatoes and no dessert." Faith crossed her arms. "We don't have dessert most nights. You can come to our house sometime," Di offered brightly. "We have Susan. She makes pie, even on Mondays." "I like pie," said Carl gravely. "We should make a society," Nan declared suddenly, "like the Explorers Club, or maybe the Rainbow Valley Society for Adventure and Secrets." "Yes," Faith agreed, "and we should have passwords and missions and a map. We still come back tomorrow," Jem promised. Same time. The Blythe children slipped away through the trees, their voices growing fainter with each step. Left behind, the Merediths lingered in the golden hush. "Do you think they'll come back?" Una asked softly. Faith nodded. "Of course they will. This place is magic, and so are they." Chapter 4. The Ordeal of Church Expectations. Sunday came bright and fair, with golden shafts of sunlight spilling across Glen St. Mary like an early benediction. Birds flitted from spruce to spruce, the harbour shimmered, and even the dusty windows of the manse glowed with promise. For the village, Sunday meant order, reverence, and tradition. But for the Meredith children, it meant a challenge they never quite mastered: church. At Ingleside, Sunday morning was a well-oiled routine. Anne, with her deft hands, coaxed tangled hair into braids and curls, buttoned dresses and polished shoes. Susan Baker reigned in the kitchen like a general, ensuring that no child left for service without breakfast, handkerchief, and the proper number of buttons. The Meredith children, however, had no Susan, and their father, good-hearted though he was, always lost track of time somewhere between writing his sermon and rereading obscure theological texts. "Faith, you start wearing your everyday dress again," Jerry observed, looking up from his attempt to clean Carl Sip's fingernails with a knife. "The blue one is for Sundays." "The blue one sits torn," Faith replied, "and Una first wearing it. Besides, the hem on this one is mostly clean. It has a hole in the elbow." "I'm going to keep my elbows down all service," she said defiantly. Or nay, her neat hair tied with a fraying ribbon, was already fretting. "We still be late again." Carl emerged from behind the manse, muddy up to his knees. "I had to feed Krusty," he explained, holding up a worm like a sacred offering. "Carl," Faith groaned. "Go wash. You can sit bring worms to church." Mr. Meredith, his white collar askew and a sheaf of notes fluttering in his Bible, came downstairs blinking. "Children, are we? Oh dear, what time is it?" They made it to the church, barely, in a rush of mismatched shoes, hairpins, and breathless apologies. Their pew near the front was an inheritance from previous ministers, and so they were in full view of everyone. Glen St. Mary's congregation was not cruel, but it was exacting. The appearance of the Meredith children had become a weekly topic of conversation. Their crumpled collars, patched skirts, and uncanny ability to lose hymn books did not go unnoticed. Faith, unaware of the stir she caused, plopped into her seat and fanned herself with a folded bulletin. Carl tried to stifle a sneeze, unsuccessfully, and then extracted a snail shell from his pocket, inspecting it thoughtfully during the call to worship. Anna sat stiffly, trying very hard to look solemn and keep her hands folded. She stole glances at the Blythes, seated 2 pews back, perfectly composed, immaculately dressed. Jem gave a barely perceptible wave when no one was looking. Walter offered a tiny, encouraging smile, but Anna's heart was heavy. Then it happened. Mr. Meredith, reaching the third point of his sermon, an eloquent passage on the peace of divine order, paused to turn a page in his notes. But the page stuck. As he fumbled with it, a sharp whisper cut the silence. "Papa forgot his place again," Faith murmured, not quite under her breath. A titter ran through the pews. "I was only helping," she whispered later, mortified. Things deteriorated further during the final hymn, when Carl, leaning too far forward, accidentally dropped the snail shell down the collar of the woman in front of him, Mrs. Kent, the church organist. She gasped, shrieked, and stood up abruptly in the middle of verse 3, causing the hymn to collapse like a row of dominoes. Carl was mortified. The congregation was stunned. The Blyths were wide-eyed, and Reverend Meredith, realizing something had gone wrong, but not what, wrapped up the hymn with a shaky amen and closed the service. Back at the manse, the children were subdued. "Assert." "Sorry," Carl said quietly, holding the now empty snail shell in both hands. "I didn't mean to. It was supposed to be a lucky one." Faith was pacing the garden in frustration. "We are not doing well. People talk about us every week, Una. I heard Mrs. Taylor say we cert, disgrace to the pulpit. Cert. But we're trying," Una said, her voice small. "I wish we had a mother." Faith burst out. She sipped fix things. She sipped remember what to wear and sew our sleeves, and stopped Carl from putting snails in his pocket. They all went silent after that. Even Jerry, who had just come in from patching the gate, sat down on the steps and said nothing. Upstairs, John Meredith sat in his study, surrounded by books and sermon drafts. The events of the morning had already faded from his thoughts, replaced by contemplation of a passage in Isaiah. He had heard a shriek in the middle of a hymn, but had assumed it to be a bee. Back at Ingleside, Anne sat in the parlor with Miss Cornelia, who had stopped in for her usual Sunday commentary. "They are good children, Anne," Miss Cornelia said, after recounting the snail incident in excruciating detail, "but they need a woman's Sip's hand. They need kindness," Anne replied quietly, "more than anything else." And in Rainbow Valley later that afternoon the children gathered. Faith told the story of the snail as if it were a grand comedy, and the Blythes laughed until their sides hurt. Even Carl giggled a little when Walter solemnly awarded him the Medal of Misguided Heroism. "It's not so bad," Jem said as they lay back in the grass. "You stir braver than anyone I know." Faith blinked. "You think so?" "Of course. You spoke up in church. I could never do that." They stared up through the trees where the light filtered green and golden. "Let us promise something," Faith said suddenly. "Here, in Rainbow Valley." "What sort of something?" Diaz asked. "That we always tell each other the truth and stick together, even if other people think we stir strange. And never let church clothes get in the way of real adventures," added Nan. Everyone agreed solemnly, and so the pact was made, an early fragile bond born not of polished shoes and polished manners, but of wild things, honesty, and shared mischief. Chapter 5. Sunday Mischief. The following Sunday dawned even brighter than the last, with dew on the fields and a hush over Glen St. Mary, as though the world itself were preparing to worship. Church bells would soon ring, hymns would rise from polished pews, and the air would smell of pressed linen, lavender water, and sermon ink. In the manse, however, the Meredith children awoke with a creeping sense of dread. Last week's church disaster still echoed in whispered village gossip, and Faith was determined, not just determined, but burning with purpose, to right their wrongs. This week, she declared, we shall go to church spotless, solemn, and silent. "Should I leave crusty home then?" Carl asked, eyeing the toad now comfortably nesting in a tin with moss. "Yes," said all three siblings in unison. Faith, wearing her patched blue dress carefully cleaned and sewn, pinned Anna's curls back with 2 matching clips. Jerry, ever the eldest and most pragmatic, helped Carl shine his boots with a scrap of bacon rind. Anna mended the hymn book that had lost its cover the previous Sunday. They even combed through the manse itself before they left, closing the back door carefully, though none of them quite trusted it to latch properly. It wasn't neat, nothing at the manse ever was, but it was their best effort yet. and they looked quite respectable as they walked to church, if one ignored the fact that Carl had used blackberries to stain his shirt collar a little less yellow. Inside the church, the pews were slowly filling. The Blythe children, freshly brushed and spruced, nodded encouragingly at their friends. Miss Cornelia gave them a brisk once-over and said nothing, a hopeful sign. Mr. Meredith delivered his sermon with a clear voice and fewer paper fumbles, his eyes drifting heavenward as if he saw angels in the rafters. Faith sat bolt upright. Una folded her hands. Jerry counted hymn stanzas in his head to stay focused, and Carl was doing his best. It was during the last hymn that disaster struck. A buzzing sound began faintly. Walter Blythe noticed it first, casting a curious glance behind him. Then Nan flinched and slapped at something near her ear. The hymn dragged on. Then, a shriek. From the middle of the church, a woman leapt to her feet, flailing her arms. Her bonnet flew off. Others stood in confusion. A wasp, possibly more than one. It had built a nest under one of the pews, and now, stirred by the music and movement, it was waging a small war on the congregation. Carl, who had noticed it early but hadn't wanted to interrupt the hymn, now felt compelled to act. "I knew that wasp nest was there," he cried, springing up. It was under the pew all along. The service dissolved into a flurry of startled parishioners, swatting hymn books and ducking under pews. Carl tried to assist by swinging his cap wildly. The Meredith children froze in mortification. And then, as if to underscore the scene, the old front door of the church, which had never closed properly, swung open with a loud, echoing bang. The wasps scattered. So did the order of worship. After a few moments of chaos, quiet returned. The door was shut. The wasps were gone, or defeated. Reverend Meredith, standing calmly in the pulpit, cleared his throat and said gently, "Well, perhaps the Lord sometimes sends small reminders of humility." And with that, he gave the benediction. The walk back to the manse was heavy with shame and sticky with disappointment. Faith trudged ahead of the others, arms crossed, her good intentions shattered. Carl, flushed and silent, held his cap like it might sting him. Jerry said nothing, and Una's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. At the Blythes' dinner table, the story was already being retold with dramatic flair. Walter was composing a poem about wasps in church. Jem claimed he'd nearly slain one with a hymn book. Rilla, too young to understand, insisted she saw a big bug flying with a hat on. Anne, listening, grew thoughtful. "I think those children are doing the best they can," she said. "They just have no one to steer the ship." That evening, the Meredith children sat outside the manse, the twilight dimming to purple over the harbour. "Faith," Una said softly, "it wasn't your fault." "I wanted us to be good," Faith whispered, "but it sits like we set and are cursed on Sundays." "Maybe we sir not meant to fit," Carl muttered, poking a stick into the dirt. "Maybe we sir different." "Different doesn't sit mean bad," Jerry said. "But maybe we need help." "From Papa?" Faith asked. "No," Jerry replied. "From each other, and maybe from our friends." And so in that moment, a quiet decision was made. Not a pact or a promise, but a shift. They wouldn't stop trying, but they'd stop trying alone. In Rainbow Valley the next afternoon, the Blythes and Merediths reunited. "I think the wasps just wanted to be part of the choir," Nan said, making Faith laugh for the first time that day. "We should make our own church," Di suggested, "where no one has to sit still for an hour and a half." "With moss pews," added Carl. "And wasps only allowed if they sing in key," said Walter, deadpan. The children laughed, lying in the warm grass, the troubles of Sunday slowly fading into the background of memory. One more page in the story of Rainbow Valley. Chapter 6. The Trouble with Mary Vance. The trouble with Mary Vance began on a Tuesday afternoon that began like any other in Rainbow Valley, quiet, golden, and stitched together with birdsong. The Blythe and Meredith children were deep in the middle of a grand and very serious debate over whether to construct a moss-covered fort or a raft from driftwood, when Nan suddenly sat up and whispered, "Someone's crying." They froze. Even the brook seemed to hush. "Over there," Walter said, pointing toward a tangle of brambles near the far edge of the valley. Jem was the first to push through, followed by Faith, who looked ready to fight off a bear if need be. What they found was no bear, but a girl, no older than themselves, huddled under a wild rose bush. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her hair, thick, light brown and braided loosely, had leaves stuck in it. She clutched a battered parcel tied in an old tea towel and glared up at them, as if daring them to ask what was wrong. "Who are you?" Jem asked, not unkindly. "I sump Mary Vance," the girl snapped, "and I ain't set crying." "You were crying," said Carl, peering at her curiously. "Your eyes are red." "Well, I ain't set now, so it doesn't count." Faith stepped forward, offering her hand in the no-nonsense way that had always worked with Una. "Where did you come from?" Mary hesitated, eyeing them all. "I ran away." "From Weber?" Una asked gently. "From the Thomases. Mrs. Thomas is the meanest woman in the world. She locked me in the woodshed last night for eating too many preserves. I told her I sit to leave, and I did. Slept in a haystack." There was a silence. The children were all looking at her now, with a mixture of shock, sympathy, and curiosity. In Glen St. Mary, runaways were the stuff of novels or cautionary tales, not something that landed, hungry and angry, in Rainbow Valley. Faith sat down beside her. "Are you hungry?" Mary sniffed. "Only if you got something good." That evening, Mary Vance followed the Merediths home. She was fed a modest supper, seated with some ceremony at the manse table, and offered the best chair by the fireplace. Meredith, who'd returned late from a parish call, listened with polite confusion as Mary offered him a rehearsed and slightly embellished tale of mistreatment and noble escape. He blinked at her from behind his spectacles, nodded, and said, "Yes, yes, very distressing," before drifting back into a discussion of lamentations. It was decided, unofficially, that Mary would stay for a while. The next few days were a whirlwind. Mary Vance was a force. She was confident, brash, and talked more in an hour than Una did in a week. She declared the manse a disgrace to all decent housekeeping, and without permission began scrubbing corners, beating rugs, and reorganizing the kitchen in a flurry of scolding and humming. She told the Meredith children exactly what she thought of their clothing, table manners, and lack of indoor rules. She lectured Carl on the proper care of toads. No lady wants to eat supper with something slimy under the table, and informed Jerry that his boots smelled like a dead fish and should be buried accordingly. Faith, who was not used to being managed, glared at her constantly. Una wilted under Mary's sharp tongue. Carl ignored her as best he could. Only Jerry seemed to appreciate Mary's unsolicited attempts to bring order to their household. When she followed them to Rainbow Valley one afternoon, Faith nearly turned her away. "This is our place," Faith said, arms crossed. "Private." Mary blinked. "I don't care if it sets the moon. I can go where I please. It sets a free country." Jem tried diplomacy. "It sits just Rainbow Valley is where we imagine things. It sits sort of special." "I like special places," Mary said, plopping down in the grass. "And you lot need me. I can teach you all sorts of things. I know how to tie Sailor Sep's knots, and what boys dream about at night, and why people get the measles." The children exchanged weary glances. "She talks a lot," Di whispered to Nan. "But she does know a lot," Nan whispered back. Despite her bluster, there was something vulnerable in Mary. She was fierce because she had to be alone since her parents died, shuffled from one hard-hearted household to another. Mary had grown up fast, defending herself with sarcasm and stubborn pride. Anne Blythe noticed it when Mary came to Ingleside. The following week, she arrived uninvited, trailed by a confused-looking Shirley and a basket of dandelion greens. "Sip, brought you some wild salad," she declared. Anne, both amused and sympathetic, invited her in. She Sips had no one to soften her, Anne told Miss Cornelia later. Only hard edges sharpened against harder ones, but she Sips bright, very bright. Mary quickly became a part of the children's world, whether they liked it or not. She barged into games, criticized their grammar, corrected their manners, and lectured them on topics ranging from mending socks to the dangers of romantic novels. And while she exasperated them, she also made things happen, things none of them would have thought of. She helped the Blythe girls build a stone oven for their make-believe picnics, taught Di how to properly plait straw for hats, and even convinced Carl to part with 2 of his beetle specimens for the sake of sanitation. But it wasn't he all improvement and light. "She acts like she owns us," Faith fumed one evening. "She doesn't know any better," Anna murmured. "She sits bossy and annoying," Carl added. but I kind of like her. The truth was, Mary Vance had become part of their story, part of Rainbow Valley, and as irritating as she could be, they all began to see something underneath the brashness, a girl who desperately wanted to belong, who had never had her own corner of the world. And in their own strange, mismatched and magical way, the children gave her one. Chapter 7. The Tale of the Rooster and the Graveyard. The Meredith children were not generally in the habit of making a scene in public, at least not on purpose. But it was a matter of Glen St. Two. Mary recalled that the most outrageous, side-splitting and entirely inappropriate incident of the summer occurred on a crisp Saturday afternoon when the community gathered at the church for a solemn funeral. It began as most misadventures do, with Carl. Carl Meredith had a fondness for things with feathers, scales or slime. His bedroom at the manse, which he shared with Jerry, looked more like a natural history exhibit than a sleeping quarters. Jars lined the windowsill, filled with beetles, snails, caterpillars, and the occasional frog, while birds' nests, feathers, and skulls adorned his shelves like sacred treasures. But of all his living specimens, none were as dear to Carl as Adam, his rooster. Adam was a majestic creature, plump and proud, with rust-red plumage and a comb that glowed like a crown. He followed Carl everywhere, strutting with importance, and seemed to possess an almost unnatural understanding of human speech. "I sep training him," Carl often said. "He knows how to come when called, he can peck in a circle, and he likes music, especially the hymn sep rock of ages." It was unfortunate then that Carl brought Adam to the churchyard on the day of Mr. Hamilton's funeral. Why would you bring a rooster to a funeral? Faith demanded as they gathered near the gate in their Sunday best. "I didn't stut bring him," Carl said indignantly. "He followed me, and he wouldn't stut go home when I told him. I can stut just leave him. He gets upset if I disappear too long." "I suppose he's mourning Mr. Hamilton too," Mary Vance muttered. Mr. Hamilton had been an elderly farmer with no close family, but everyone in Glen St. Mary attended the service out of respect. The grave was freshly dug beneath the maple trees, and the wind moved gently through the branches, rustling the hymn pages in the mourner's hands. All was still, all was hushed, until Adam crowed. Not once, not shyly. He belted out a resounding, echoing cock-a-doodle-doo, just as Reverend Meredith lifted his hands for the prayer. Heads turned, eyes widened. Someone stifled a gasp. Miss Cornelia's hat trembled. Carl, horrified, tried to wave Adam off. The rooster, delighted with the attention, hopped onto a tombstone and crowed again, as if eulogizing the dead with poultry pride. Walter Blythe buried his face in his hymnal, his shoulders shaking. Jem bit his lip so hard it nearly bled. Nan and Dear were holding hands, their eyes wide with helpless amusement. Carl made a lunge for Adam, but the rooster darted away, flapping across the grass, scattering petals from the funeral wreaths. The final blow came when Adam, in a burst of energy, leapt onto the coffin itself. There was a collective intake of breath. For one frozen moment, Adam stood there, puffed up like a general surveying a battlefield. Then he crowed again, 3 full-throated cries, before fluttering down and darting into the hedges. The solemnity of the funeral collapsed into chaos. Several people gasped audibly. One woman fainted. Elder Binns was heard to mutter, "Well, I never," while Miss Cornelia whispered sharply to Anne Blythe, "That boy needs a keeper, or at least a leash for that fowl." Carl stood by the grave, crimson with embarrassment, clutching his cap and mumbling, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean for him to do that." Reverend Meredith, whose mind had been fixed firmly on the hereafter, blinked in confusion. He had noticed a disturbance, but remained unclear about its source. Afterward, when the mourners dispersed, and the incident was thoroughly dissected in hushed tones, the Meredith children slunk back to the manse, with Carl dragging behind them, silent and shaken. "I ruined everything," he said mournfully. "No," Faith said, though she was still pink with second-hand embarrassment. "Adam ruined everything." "It's Sit's not your fault," Una added kindly. "You didn't he sit do that." "I did," Mary Vance said bluntly, "but Rooster Six got more pride than a peacock in a hall of mirrors." "Mr. Hamilton probably would have liked it," Walter said thoughtfully. "He was fond of chickens. Remember, he used to bring eggs to the manse." Carl gave a small, reluctant smile. "You think so?" "I think Adam gave him a very unique send-off," Jem said. Better than silence, anyway. That evening in Rainbow Valley, the children retold the story with dramatic flair. Walter composed an exaggerated ballad titled The Rooster's Requiem, which had everyone laughing in spite of themselves. Even Carl, though still red-faced, chuckled at the part where Adam was described as the fowl who dared defy decorum. Anne, hearing about the incident secondhand, sighed into her teacup. Oh dear, those poor children. Miss Cornelia, darning a sock with firm energy, sniffed. They so good-hearted, but that household is one rooster away from scandal every Sunday. They need love, Anne said simply. More than sermons and rules, they need someone to care and to teach them gently. Carl, meanwhile, built Adam a proper coop that night, weeping just a little as he did so. He promised the rooster he would never take him to church again. And Adam, unrepentant, proud, and entirely satisfied with his performance, nestled into his straw as if he had indeed sung a soul into heaven. Chapter 8. Unacept's Secret. Of all the Meredith children, Una was the quietest. She didn't scale trees like Faith, or experiment with insects like Carl. She wasn't the eldest like Jerry, called upon to solve problems and patch fences. She lived often in the background, where shadows were soft, where thoughts grew gently, where no one noticed if she remained still, and that most of the time was perfectly fine with Una. But lately, a worry had begun to settle deep in her heart, as heavy as a stone dropped into a still pond. She was ashamed. Not ashamed of her siblings, exactly, or even of their occasional chaos. She loved them, wild, wonderful, frustrating, messy. But love didn't stop her from wishing they were more like the Blythes, composed, neat, admired. The Blythe children had bright clothes and polished shoes, and a mother who brushed their hair and kissed their foreheads. They didn't show up to funerals with livestock. They didn't whisper during hymns or come to Sunday school with torn cuffs and dried jam on their collars. But it wasn't set only that. It was her father too. Reverend John Meredith, with his distant eyes and soft voice, loved Una deeply. But she sometimes wondered if he loved his books just a little more. When she watched him lost in scripture, unmoving as the world spun around him, she felt a strange sadness settle in her chest. It wasn't lack of love, but a kind of loneliness that came from feeling unseen. So Una did what quiet children often do. She tried harder. She said her prayers twice a night. She made lists of good deeds and checked them off when she was sure no one was looking. She sewed up Carl's missing buttons and cleaned the porch steps with a rag. She made herself small so others could shine. She tried to be good, not for praise, but for redemption. She also began a secret habit. Every afternoon when no one noticed, Una would slip away with a small battered Bible pressed to her chest and walk alone to a corner of the churchyard, beneath the tallest pine tree. There, she would kneel quietly in the grass, bow her head, and whisper prayers for her family. She prayed that Carl would stop putting frogs in the wash basin, that Faith would hold her tongue when Miss Cornelia visited, that their father would remember to eat dinner, or notice when Una passed him a note. But most of all, she prayed that they would stop being a disgrace. She had heard the word often enough from ladies in the village, from whispered conversations at the back of the church. It stung like a nettle every time. "I don't want us to be laughed at anymore," she whispered one day, eyes shut tight. "Please help us, help me." She never told anyone about these prayers, not even Faith. Some things were too secret to share. Meanwhile, at Ingleside, Anne Blythe had noticed the difference in Una. "She reminds me of myself at that age," Anne mused one evening, speaking to Gilbert as they walked in the garden. "Quiet and watchful, but she carries something heavier." "Guilt?" Gilbert asked gently. "No," Anne said. "Responsibility. She tries to fix things she can sit even name." That Sunday, Reverend Meredith forgot he was preaching at the neighboring village and arrived 10 minutes late, breathless and apologetic. The organist stalled by playing Nera, My God, to Thee 3 times, and Carl accidentally knocked over a hymnal stack trying to help. Afterwards, someone muttered, "Why can't that family ever be proper?" Una heard it. She always heard. That evening, when the children gathered in Rainbow Valley, she was quiet as the others told jokes and acted out scenes from the story Walter was writing. "You all right?" Walter asked her quietly, sitting beside her on a mossy log. Una hesitated. Walter was not like the other boys. He never laughed too loudly, or made her feel like a shadow. He understood what it meant to feel out of place. "I just want to be better," she whispered, picking at a leaf. "I want us all to be better. We try, but it sips never enough." Walter nodded. "Some people only see what sits missing. They don't see what sits there." Onda glanced at him. "They don't see that you hold Carl Sips' hand when he sips scared, or that you sew Faith Sips' cuffs when she forgets, or that you Sips are kind even when the world isn't Sips." She looked down, face warm. "It doesn't change what people say." "No," Walter said, "but it changes who you are, and that Sips more important." They sat together in silence, watching the shadows stretch longer across the valley. Overhead, the trees rustled in a gentle hush, as if listening. Later, Anna would write that moment in her notebook, the one she never showed anyone, not even Faith. She wrote, "There is kindness in the world, even when it's small. Maybe it is enough to keep trying." That night, Una did not go to the churchyard to pray. She stayed on the manse porch instead, watching stars bloom over the hills. She said her prayers inside, quietly, with a little less desperation and a little more hope. Chapter 9, Faith Sips' Declaration. If Una was the quiet heart of the Meredith family, Faith was its blazing fire. She laughed the loudest, argued the quickest, and took every slight, real or imagined, straight to the bone. Where Una wilted under disapproval, Faith burned, and lately she'd been burning a lot. The villagers' whispers had grown louder since the rooster incident. Faith had overheard Mrs. Taylor declare, "Those Meredith children are a scandal," while picking up sugar at the store. Miss Wiggins, the church elder's sister, had shaken her head and said something about ungodly neglect. Even kind-hearted Mrs. Elliot, who often dropped off pies, had gently mentioned how the manse children meant well, bless them, in the kind of tone that made Faith's cheeks flame. It was one thing to criticize Carl for bringing snakes to Sunday school, or to gossip about their tattered clothing, but Faith couldn't bear the way people talked about her father, absent-minded though he was. Reverend John Meredith was kind and honest and gentle. He spoke truthfully. He read to them when he remembered. He loved them in his distracted, drifting way. So when Mrs. Tom Pryor muttered, "That poor man should be removed from the pulpit, he can't even keep his children in order," Faith felt something snap deep inside her chest. That week, she made a plan. Sunday morning came with the usual chaos. Carl's clean shirt had a mysterious green stain. Una couldn't find her shoe, and Faith's hair refused to lie flat, no matter how many times she brushed it. Mary Vance, observing from the kitchen, declared, "You all need a governess and a gallon of vinegar." "Oh, third." Faith ignored her. Her mind was elsewhere. At church, she was unusually quiet. Una noticed her stillness and reached for her hand during the first hymn. Faith barely responded. Her eyes were fixed on the front of the sanctuary. Mr. Meredith was preaching on the small voice of conscience. The irony of that did not escape Faith. He spoke eloquently. He always did when he found his way through his notes, but Faith could see the twitch in his sleeve where his coat seam had split, and the ink smudge on his collar. He looked like a man who belonged in a library, not under the judgment of pew-bound ladies who clucked over his children's socks. When the sermon ended and the final hymn began, Faith's heart thudded in her ears. Her mouth was dry, her palms were sweaty, but she stood up before the hymn ended and turned to face the church. The room fell silent. "I want to say something," she declared, her voice surprisingly strong. The organist's fingers froze. Someone in the second pew gasped audibly. The minister blinked. Faith took a deep breath. "We stub are not bad children. We stub are just trying the best we can. We don't stub are have a mother, and sometimes things go wrong. But we don't stub are mean to be rude or disrespectful. Papa works very hard, and he Sips the kindest man I know, and I think people shouldn't let whisper about us if they don't stub our understand." There was a stunned silence. You could have heard a pin drop, or at least a dropped hymnal. Faith Sips' voice softened. "I just wanted you to know." Then she sat down, cheeks crimson, hands trembling in her lap. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Reverend Meredith, startled and pale, stepped back into the pulpit. He cleared his throat once, then again, but no words came. It was Miss Cornelia, of all people, who finally stood. "Well," she said, her voice brisk and unshakable, "that Sips the first honest thing this congregation Sips heard in a while. Let Sips sing the last verse again, and this time, with feeling. And so they did. After church, the children fled. They didn't wait to shake hands or nod politely at old ladies with dainty gloves. They ran, half laughing, half terrified, all the way to Rainbow Valley, where they collapsed under their favorite maple tree, breathless. "You did it," Jem said. Awe in his voice. "You actually did it." "I think I'm going to faint now," Faith murmured, covering her face with her hands. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Walter said solemnly. "Braver than Carl Sips' rooster. I thought we were going to be struck by lightning," Dill admitted. "I was trying to speak from the heart," Faith said. "I don't think it worked." "Oh, it worked," said Mary Vance, who had followed them, arms crossed. "It worked so well you're going to be the subject of at least 5 tea table discussions this week." "Was it really that bad?" Faith asked, sitting up. "No," Una said softly. "It was good. It was right." And deep down, Faith knew it. Even if people stared at her in the village, even if Miss Wiggins never smiled at them again, even if her father was confused for days, she had said the thing that needed saying. That evening, Anne Blythe found herself looking out over the harbour from her garden bench, reflecting on the day's events. She did what most adults wouldn't dare. She told Gilbert, spoke truth in front of judgment, defended her father in front of strangers. "Faith Meredith is a remarkable girl," Gilbert said with a smile. "She is," Anne agreed. "Though heaven help us if she decides to run for Parliament someday." And at the manse, Reverend Meredith sat quietly in his study, staring at his hands. For the first time in many years, he saw himself through his daughter's eyes, and the truth of her small, trembling voice unsettled him more than any theological debate ever had. He rose slowly and walked to Faith Sips' room. She looked up from her bed, wide-eyed. "I didn't mean to embarrass you, Papa," she said quickly. He sat beside her, gently smoothing her hair. "You didn't sit," he said. "You reminded me of something I forgot, that love is not just felt, it must be seen." Faith smiled, and he smiled back. And though nothing looked different the next morning, something had shifted. Faith walked with a lighter step, the villagers blinked a little more thoughtfully, and the whispering for once grew quieter. Chapter 10. Gossip and Good Intentions. In Glen St. Mary, gossip flowed more predictably than the tides. It drifted from parlours and post offices, seeped into sewing circles and Sunday schools, and settled like dust over doorsteps and dinner tables. This week, as expected, the talk was all about Faith Meredith's outburst in church. "Bold, wasn't she?" said Mrs. Taylor, lowering her teacup meaningfully. "Brazen, I say," sniffed Miss Wiggins. "Interrupting a service like that. What fits next? Sermons from the pews." "She Sips got fire," admitted Mrs. Elliot. "But you Sips got to admit, it took courage, she didn't lie." As for Miss Cornelia Bryant, she had already declared that the girl had more backbone than half the men in the district, and refused to say another negative word about the Meredith children for the rest of the week, though she made no such promise for the week after. In truth, Faith's declaration had unsettled more people than it had offended. It pricked at their consciences, forced them to look past appearances, and reminded them uncomfortably of the fragility behind a brave face. At Ingleside, Anne Blythe was folding linens in the kitchen when Susan Baker stormed in, indignant. "As it's been telling you, Mrs. Blythe, if I hear one more old biddy say those poor Meredith children are beyond redemption, I shall serve her dandelion wine and tell her it's 6 gooseberry cordial." Anne laughed softly. Would it really taste all that different? "The point is," Susan huffed, "they need help, not sermons. A decent coat, a proper pie, a bit of peace." "Yister right," Anne said gently, smoothing out the last linen. "And perhaps it's Stips time we do more than sympathize." Anne did not say so aloud, but Faith's courage had stirred something deep in her, something maternal and fierce. She remembered with aching clarity what it felt like to be young and judged, to try so hard to be good, while the world seemed to misunderstand every effort. So she set to work, quietly, kindly, and without ceremony. On Tuesday afternoon, a fresh apple pie arrived at the manse, wrapped in a clean towel, no note, but the handwriting on the label said cinnamon added. On Wednesday, 3 of Carl's shirts came back from the wash, mysteriously mended and smelling faintly of lilacs. On Thursday, the manse woodpile, long neglected and dwindling, was suddenly refilled. Jerry swore he didn't cut it. Carl believed it was elves. Mary Vance insisted it was divine providence or maybe Miss Cornelia with an axe. On Friday, Susan Baker accidentally made too much soup and delivered it herself. Faith narrowed her eyes. "Is this pity?" she asked Anne that evening, when they met on the path between Ingleside and the manse. Anne smiled. "No, it's what neighbors do when they care." Faith considered that for a long moment before nodding, slowly, then, "Thank you." Meanwhile, Reverend Meredith, having finally grasped the depth of his children's struggle, he began attending to more than just his sermons, helping Jerry repair a gate, remembering Una's name day, even brushing a layer of dust from the long-neglected front parlor. One evening, he found Carl examining a wounded sparrow in the garden. "Can I help?" he asked, surprising them both. Carl looked up, hopeful. "Do you know how to fix wings?" "I'm not sure," the minister said, kneeling beside him, "but I can try." The Blythe and Meredith children, sensing the shift, didn't speak of it. Children rarely talk about good things while they're happening. They simply live them. But they noticed. There were fewer cold dinners. The manse smelled faintly of fresh baking. Miss Cornelia didn't glare quite so hard at Faith on Sundays. Even Mary Vance stopped threatening to run off and become a maid for a real family, though she did occasionally threaten to leave if Carl brought another caterpillar into the pantry. Rainbow Valley itself seemed to respond to the change. The brook sang more brightly, the trees shimmered with golden light, and a family of foxes took up residence in the far corner of the woods. The children built a new fort from fallen logs, and Jem designed a flag from old handkerchiefs that fluttered like a proud secret above their meeting place. One afternoon, the children decided to clean up the old manse garden. Weeds had overtaken the flower beds, and the rose bushes had grown wild and bramble-heavy. With sleeves rolled and spirits high, they weeded, pruned and planted, Faith commanding the effort like a general, Carl attempting to rescue every worm, and Walter composing an ode to a dandelion he insisted was too noble to pull. By the end of the day, the garden wasn't perfect, but it was alive. They called it the Garden of Second Chances. "I like that," Una said softly, brushing dirt from her hands. "That's what this feels like." "What?" Faith asked. "Like we sit getting another chance to do things better." Faith looked up at the house. Its shutters were still crooked, the porch still creaked, but there was smoke from the chimney and laughter in the windows. "Yeah," she said, "I think we are." And so the gossip in Glen St. Mary shifted again, not in dramatic declarations, but in small, tentative goodwill. "They say the Meredith children are settling down," said Mrs. Taylor. "Well, perhaps they just needed a little encouragement," offered Mrs. Elliot. "I still don't trust that rooster," Miss Wiggins muttered. But for the first time in a long time, the manse was not a punchline, but a place of possibility. And for the children, especially Faith, it meant something even bigger: hope. Chapter 11. A Minister in Love. Despite his scholarly sermons and threadbare coat, Reverend John Meredith was still a man with a heart, and it was quietly, tenderly, waking up. It had been many years since his wife had passed. The ache of her absence had dulled into a muted sorrow, folded into the corners of his days, like an old letter kept in a drawer. His children were reminders of her, all in different ways. Jerry's quiet strength, Una's sweetness, Faith's fire, and even Carl's curiosity. He had loved her deeply, still did in his quiet way, but the loneliness had begun to press in, made more visible now by Faith's brave public defense and the village's wary warmth. And then there was Rosemary West. She had always been there, first as the bright young schoolteacher with clever hands and a sharp wit, then as a friend of Anne Blythe, often seen walking the ridge path to Ingleside. She wasn't showy or fashionable, but there was something about her, the calm in her voice, the quiet way she listened, the dry humor behind her steady eyes, that made people lean in when she spoke. John Meredith had always admired her, but lately he had begun to see her, and Rosemary, for her part, had been noticing him too. One summer evening he was walking home from a pastoral visit when he saw her near the orchard gate, arms full of wildflowers. The wind had loosened her hair slightly, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Miss West," he said, tipping his hat awkwardly. "Mr. Meredith," she replied with a small, amused smile. "You look as though you've been walking through a philosophy." He blinked. "I suppose I have." a particularly dense one. She laughed, and the sound startled him, not for its volume, but for how bright it was, like sunlight after weeks of overcast skies. They walked a little together, speaking of ordinary things: the orchard bloom, the upcoming school term, the latest village scandal involving Mrs. Bell's goose escaping into the post office. But beneath the words, something else flickered, unspoken, uncertain, but alive. The children, of course, noticed everything. "Papa's in love," Faith declared bluntly at breakfast the next morning, slathering jam onto a biscuit. "He is not," Anna whispered, scandalized. "That's Sip's a serious thing to say." "He is," Carl agreed. He looked at Miss West like Adam looks at the kitchen door when he smells biscuits. Jerry frowned. He might admire her, that Sip's different. "Well, I hope he marries her," Faith said. "She sits lovely, and she sits make us brush our hair." That afternoon in Rainbow Valley, the subject was discussed in earnest. "We should help them," Dee said excitedly. "It's Sep's romantic." "We don't set meddle in romance," Walter said solemnly. "It's Sep's delicate." "Oh, but they need a little push," Nan insisted. "It's Sep's obvious." "We stir children," Jem pointed out. "We can sit go matchmaking." "Why not?" Faith demanded. "It's Sip's for a good cause." And so it began, the plot. The children tried their best to be subtle, though subtle meant different things to each of them. Anna picked a bouquet of wildflowers and left them on Miss West Sip's porch, signed with a note, "From a friend who thinks you should smile more." Carl began reading poetry aloud in the manse garden at just the right time each evening. Faith suggested loudly at dinner that their father really ought to ask Miss West to help organize the parish fair because she sits so clever. And Mary Vance naturally offered the boldest solution: just tell her to kiss him and get it over with. But the minister remained hesitant. A man who had buried his heart for years cannot easily dig it up, even with the best intentions. He worried, would she want a house full of unruly children? Would he be too distracted, too dull, too worn by time? Rosemary wondered too, would marrying a minister mean losing her own quiet freedom? Was she ready to take on a family? A man so absent-minded he once salted his tea. But the seeds were planted. One day, the minister knocked on the West's door with a small bouquet of garden daisies, stiff, awkward, and slightly wilted. "For your table," he said. "Or my heart?" she teased gently. He blinked. Perhaps both." They sat in the parlor, drinking lemonade and talking more honestly than they had before, about grief, about being needed, about how both of them had been tired of being alone but unsure how to change it. And when he left that day, his step was lighter. So was hers. The children knew something had shifted. "He looked dreamy at dinner," Carl whispered. "She blushed when I mentioned him," Nan reported. "They set going to fall in love for sure," Faith said with satisfaction. "We just gave them a nudge." And in Rainbow Valley, that evening, they all sat together under the big tree and imagined what it might be like to have Rosemary West as a mother. "She'd make the manse feel warm," Anna whispered. "She'd make Papa remember to eat," said Jerry. "She'd make us brush our hair," Carl grumbled, but he was smiling. Faith simply leaned back and looked up at the branches overhead, her eyes full of light. "She said to make us whole," she said. Chapter 12. The Proposal Plot. By mid-August, the children of Glen St. Mary had grown utterly impatient. The Meredith children, convinced that their father and Rosemary West were 2 conversations away from eternal happiness, were appalled to discover that neither of them had made any official move. Despite the garden visits, the friendly smiles, and the occasional exchanged book of poetry, nothing had happened. I didn't understand grown-ups," Faith fumed. "If I loved someone, I set say so, right away. Why wait?" "Maybe they sit are afraid," Anna said softly. "What if Miss West doesn't want to be a minister Set's wife?" "Well, I want her to be," said Carl, whose toads were now frequently removed from the pantry with minimal scolding, thanks to Rosemary Sip's calm presence on her last visit. "And she likes us. She said so." "Liking us isn't the same as marrying our father," Jerry muttered. But the consensus was clear. Something had to be done. So they decided to force fate in's hand. The plan, which they called Operation Matrimony, Mary Vance's title, was discussed in Rainbow Valley under strict secrecy and some very lopsided logic. "It's simple," Faith explained, pacing like a general. We put them in a situation where they sibber alone, comfortable, and aware of their feelings. And if that doesn't set work, Mary Vance added, we lock them in a room until they kiss or cry for help. Mary, Yana whispered, horrified. We can kidnap them. It sits not kidnapping, Mary replied. It sits romantic strategy. I think, Walter said delicately, that perhaps we should aim for something slightly more poetic than Mary Sepp's plan. Fine, Faith said. We settle for encouragement and ambience. That Friday, the opportunity presented itself. Anne Blythe invited Miss West to a quiet garden tea at Ingleside. Mr. Meredith was to call for a parish matter the same afternoon, and so the children laid the groundwork. Jem and Jerry were tasked with accidentally going missing, so Miss West would stay longer. Carl placed a new flower arrangement, wild asters and goldenrod, in the Ingleside parlor with a note that read, "Every home needs a touch of wildness." Faith convinced Susan Baker to leave out her best raspberry tartlets and arrange the tea tray under the big willow. Mary Vance stood by with a lookout system in case anyone tried to interrupt the couple. And then, with hearts thudding and fingers crossed, they waited. Mr. Meredith arrived a few minutes late, as always, and found Miss West alone beneath the willow tree, sunlight dancing through the branches. "You stirred just in time," she said with a smile. Anne had to step out for a moment. "Sit. There, there's tea and tartlets, the kind that crumble and leave you wanting more." He smiled, awkwardly at first, and sat, and then, as the breeze curled through the garden and birds chirped overhead, something rare and precious unfolded. They talked. Not in polite nothings or philosophical tangents, but truly, openly. He told her of his fear that he wasn't enough, for his children, for the parish, for her, that he had forgotten what it meant to be a man who needed love, not just faith, that he sometimes felt like a ghost in his own life. She told him she had once planned to go to Europe, to teach in cities, to become someone else entirely, but had stayed because she wanted roots. She wanted mornings with meaning, children in her kitchen, laughter at supper, and someone who could look at her not as Miss West, the capable schoolteacher, but as Rosemary. The words came slowly at first, but once the ice was broken, they came like rain after drought. And when the silence returned, it was warm and full, not awkward. "Rosemary," he said finally, his voice rough with nerves, "do you think, that is, could you ever imagine being a Minister Sipp's wife?" "I already imagine being your wife," she said, very simply. And there it was. No dramatic scene, no fireworks, no locked door, but a simple moment between two people who had waited long enough. Back in Rainbow Valley, the children were writhing with suspense. "What if it didn't work?" Nan whispered. "What if they argued?" Dee asked. "What if he spilled tea on her lap?" Carl fretted. But when Anne returned home later that afternoon, a smile on her face and a twinkle in her eye, they knew. Walter was the first to speak. They sit or engaged, unsipped they, and just smiled. You still know soon enough. The next day, Rosemary visited the manse for tea and never left. The children were called in one by one, like witnesses to a miracle. "Are you really going to be our mother?" Faith asked, holding her breath. "If you shall have me," Rosemary replied. Carl hugged her tightly. Jerry nodded with quiet relief. Connor began to cry, tears spilling silently down her cheeks as Rosemary drew her close and whispered, "Yes, my love, you can cry now. You don't have to carry it all alone anymore." And in that moment, the manse became a home. In Rainbow Valley, that evening, the children celebrated by declaring it National Family Day, complete with a pinecone coronation for Rosemary, whom they dubbed Queen of Comfort and Cake. "She's everything we hoped for," Faith whispered, lying on the grass with her arms folded behind her head. "And more," said Ina, eyes fixed on the stars. "I knew our plan would work," Mary Vance sniffed. "Romance is just science with prettier words." And for once, nobody argued with her. Because for the Meredith children, the world had shifted, and the ache in their hearts had begun to heal. Chapter 13, The Rainbow Valley Pact. The day after Rosemary West became in all but law a Meredith, the world felt transformed. The man's kitchen, long a place of clatter and empty cupboards, now smelled of fresh bread and warm spices. Rosemary moved through the rooms like someone who belonged there all along, not in a whirlwind of change, but with gentle, deliberate grace. She cleaned without fuss, organized without judgment, and somehow managed to do it all without making anyone feel small. Even Susan Baker, hearing of Rosemary Sipp's impending role, declared over a batch of preserves, "Thank the good Lord, those children finally have a mother worth her salt, and I wouldn't set mind borrowing that pie crust recipe either." At first, the Meredith children didn't quite know what to do with themselves. Carl kept asking if it was really all right to eat the last biscuit. Jerry mumbled thank you too often and too quietly. Faith alternated between fierce pride and suspicious caution. Una, sweet Una, just followed Rosemary from room to room, eyes shining like lanterns. But it was Walter Blythe, ever observant, who said what everyone else was feeling. "She makes things feel safe, doesn't she?" That week, in Rainbow Valley, the children gathered as always, but there was a shift in the air, like the scent of clover after rain. The sun filtered lazily through the trees, and the brook gurgled like it was telling secrets. Faith arrived first, her hair combed neatly, by choice, not order, and sat on the old stump throne. Dis and Nan followed, baskets in hand. Carl carried an enormous maple leaf he insisted was shaped like a dragon wing. Jem and Jerry brought apples. Una brought nothing but her smile. They sat in a circle, and for a long moment, said nothing. Then Jem spoke. "Do you realize this valley is where it all began?" "The Rooster funeral," Carl nodded solemnly. "The pie-sharing treaty," added Dee. "The day Mary Vance threatened to leave and was bribed back with blackberries," Nan smirked. Faith's face softened. "The day we met." That was it. Rainbow Valley wasn't just a hiding place. It had been their home within the world when their homes hadn't felt whole. It had kept their secrets, caught their laughter, and offered a quiet place for sorrow to soften. "We should do something," Walter said. "A kind of promise." "A pact," Una breathed. "Yes, a Rainbow Valley pact," Faith declared, "to remember everything and to promise something for the future." "What do we promise?" asked Dee. They looked at one another. Then Walter, the poet among them, said simply, "That we will always be friends, that we will always be true, and that no matter where we go, we still carry this valley inside us." Carl frowned. "It doesn't set rhyme exactly." "It doesn't have to," Walter said. "It sits perfect," Una whispered. Faith stood, brushing pine needles from her skirt. "Then we swear it." They stood in a circle, hands joined, eyes serious, and repeated the vow, some softly, some with laughter threatening to burst through, but all meant it. They gathered stones from the brook, one for each of them, and placed them under the tree roots near the entrance to the valley. "This is our marker," Jem said, "so we don't forget." "And the spawn carving a secret symbol," Carl added, already scratching into bark with a stick, "only we still know what it means." Mary Vance arrived late, holding a jar of crabapple jelly and scowling. "What's Sep's going on?" she asked. "We set making a pact," Faith said. "About what?" "Friendship," Una said softly, and remembering. Mary stared at them, then rolled her eyes, but sat down anyway. "Fine, but mine better include pie rations." The pact wasn't set written, but it lived. In the shared looks between Una and Walter, when words fell short, in the way Jem made sure Jerry always had a seat at the table, in the way Nan and Dee stitched secret pockets into their aprons for passing notes, in the way Faith let her guard down just enough to hug Rosemary without warning. That week, the manse felt like a celebration. Rosemary baked honey cakes. Miss Cornelia dropped off embroidered pillowcases with the gruff excuse, "These were lying around." Susan Baker invited Rosemary for tea and asked, in a whisper, if she might share her recipe for cinnamon muffins. Even Mr. Meredith, walking into the dining room one morning and seeing all his children seated with brushed hair and full plates, paused in quiet disbelief. "It seemed so normal," he said. Rosemary only smiled, used to be surprised what love can do. And in Rainbow Valley, the golden late summer light lingered just a little longer each evening. The trees, green with a hint of gold at their edges, stood as witness to the promise that something new had begun, not the end of childhood, but the beginning of something even richer. A valley of memory, a promise of what they'd carry forward. Always together. Chapter 14, Carl Sepp's illness. The days drifted toward autumn, golden and crisp, as if summer were reluctantly letting go. At the manse, things had never felt warmer. Rosemary's presence had taken root, calm, capable, and full of quiet kindness. The children were thriving under her gentle order. Meals happened on time, shirts were mended, laughter returned. But then, quite suddenly, Carl Meredith fell ill. It began with a fever, a quiet, creeping thing. He seemed tired one evening, too tired even to chase the frogs that had escaped his collection jar. By morning he was flushed and shivering, his breath shallow, and a strange grayness had settled into the corners of his face. Rosemary found him first. One touch of his forehead, and she was calling for Reverend Meredith, her voice unsteady. Jerry ran for Dr. Blythe. "Go fast," Rosemary told him, her knuckles white. Don sit stop. At Ingleside, Anne and Gilbert Blythe had just sat down to breakfast when Jerry burst through the gate. "Carl Sepp's sick," he said breathlessly. "Really sick. Can you come?" Gilbert was already on his feet. Dr. Blythe arrived at the manse and moved swiftly, gently. He listened to Carl's lungs, examined his throat, took in the sunken eyes and the tremor in the boy's hands. "It's a dangerous fever," he said quietly to Rosemary and Reverend Meredith. "Possibly typhoid, possibly pneumonia. We shall know more by morning. He sits very weak. We must act fast." Rosemary nodded, though her face had turned pale. John Meredith swallowed hard. "Will he?" "We shall do everything we can," Gilbert said, "but it sits us." Word spread quickly. In Glen St. Mary, gossip turned from scandal to sympathy. Mrs. Elliot brought broth. Miss Cornelia arrived with hot bricks and barley water. Even Miss Wiggins sent a note, "I shall pray, regardless of previous judgments." At Rainbow Valley, the children gathered in silence. "No one sits allowed to see him," Faith said, arms tightly crossed. "He sits too sick." "Does he know?" Honor whispered. "He knows we sit praying for him," Faith replied. "He squeezed my hand last night, just once." Walter, who had begun writing poems in the quiet hours of the evening, folded a small note and tucked it into the crook of the tree where Carl had built his beetle trap months ago. "Get well soon," it read. "We miss your creatures." Inside the manse, the hours passed in anxious rhythms. Cool cloths, sips of broth, whispered instructions. Rosemary never left Carl's side. She sat through the night, brushing his damp curls away from his forehead, reading softly from storybooks when he stirred. John Meredith, overwhelmed and helpless, did what he could, holding Carl's hand when the fever peaked, murmuring prayers at the bedside, pacing the hallway in silent grief. Faith, who had always been fearless, now cried in Rosemary's arms. "I hate waiting," she sobbed. "I spit rather fight 100 dragons." "We are fighting," Rosemary whispered back. "But this battle takes stillness and hope." The fever reached its height on the 4th night. Carl thrashed in his sleep, calling out names. Adam the rooster, his mother, a long-lost lizard named Napoleon. His breathing turned ragged, shallow. Gilbert came again, his face lined with concern. Anne followed, bearing a flask of elderberry tea and a firm hand for Rosemary's shoulder. "He sets strong," Anne said, "and he sets loved. That makes all the difference." And in the deepest dark, just before dawn, Carl began to breathe more evenly. Rosemary felt it first, her hand still on his brow. Then the others noticed the fever was breaking. By morning he opened his eyes, weak and dazed. "Did Adam come back?" he croaked. Rosemary laughed through her tears. "No, but I shall tell him you asked." The entire house sighed with relief. The recovery was slow, but steady. Carl was kept in bed, fussed over by Rosemary, and visited in careful turns. He was weak, but the light was returning to his eyes. His siblings brought him drawings, riddles, and wildflowers. Walter's Get Well poem was read aloud and received with a sleepy smile. Even Adam the rooster was allowed a supervised visit, which left Carl chuckling for the first time in a week. Anne came often, bringing small gifts and warmth. Miss Cornelia even baked seed cake, which she despised, because the boy likes it, poor soul. And Dr. Blythe, upon declaring him out of danger, patted Carl Sipp's shoulder and said, "You've got the heart of a lion under those freckles." Rainbow Valley waited. The children didn't return there until Carl was strong enough to walk, but when they did on a clear morning filled with the scent of falling leaves, they brought him there like a king returning to his court. There was a picnic and a game of Spot the Last Butterfly. and a soft breeze rustling the leaves. "I missed this place," Carl said, sitting beneath his favorite tree. "We missed you," Una said. Walter offered him a pebble shaped like a heart. "You fought the shadow and came back." Faith smiled and squeezed his hand. "Next time, warn us before you scare us to death." And in the hush that followed, as the sun dappled the mossy floor of Rainbow Valley, Carl looked up at the trees and whispered, "It's good to be alive." Chapter 15. Rosemary Sips Dilemma. Though the manse was brighter now, quieter, cleaner, filled with laughter again, the final thread of certainty had not yet been woven. The children thought it had all been decided when their father and Rosemary announced their engagement, and indeed, the promise was there: affection, companionship, a future. But there was still one quiet storm left to pass. The truth was, Rosemary West was hesitating. She hadn't told the children, she hadn't even told Anne Blythe, though Anne had already sensed it, but inside her, under the surface of joy and tea and tending to Carl's convalescence, there was fear. It came in waves, a question here, a pang there. What if she wasn't ready? What if she couldn't be the kind of mother the Meredith children deserved? What if she married John Meredith only to discover she was lonelier in company than she had ever been alone? For Rosemary, who had once imagined a quiet, orderly life with no demands beyond her garden, her pupils, and the occasional solitary walk, the prospect of marrying into chaos was both exhilarating and terrifying. And there was another problem: Ellen, her older sister. Ellen West was not unkind, but she was rigid, one of those women who wore starched collars and spoke in pronouncements. She had raised Rosemary after their parents died, and had always expected gratitude to take the form of obedience. "I said nothing against Mr. Meredith," Ellen had said, over lukewarm tea, "but you must see it would be a mistake. 4 wild children, no money, a man who forgets the day of the week. Think of your comfort, your independence, your reputation." "As it thought of them," Rosemary replied quietly, "but none of them warm the house." Ellen hadn't answered. She hadn't needed to. The silence had said, "If you do this, you do it without my approval, and perhaps without my presence." That night, Rosemary sat alone on her porch, staring into the September sky, torn between love and loyalty, longing and fear. At Ingleside, Anne was setting out tea when Rosemary arrived unexpectedly. Anne didn't ask questions. She simply poured 2 cups and waited. "I'm not sure I can do this," Rosemary said finally, voice low. Anne nodded. "It's a great leap." "Bigger than I expected," Rosemary whispered. "I love them, John, the children. I really do, but I'm afraid I lose myself in them, that I lose myself in them, that I lose myself in them, that I lose my 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 lose my. Anne smiled softly. "You one sit be. How do you know?" "Because you already are part of them. But you sits, still you. I see it." Rosemary looked at her. "Was it like this for you?" Anne Sepp's face grew thoughtful. "Yes, in different ways. I feared I lose the dreamer I was. That I stop writing, stop imagining, stop being. But love, real love, doesn't erase you, it just expands the edges." They sat in silence for a while. Then Rosemary stood. "I think I need to talk to Ellen, properly." Then I settled aside. Anne didn't stop her. She only said, "Whatever you choose, Rosemary, it will be the right thing if it comes from truth." The next day, Rosemary visited her sister's home. "I made up my mind," Rosemary said, her voice shaking a little. "I marrying John Meredith. I hope you will come. But if you can I will understand." Ellen was silent for a long time. At last, she said, "I only ever wanted you to be safe." "I know," Rosemary said, "but I want to be whole." That night, Ellen sent over a parcel of linens and a note. "You Saul need these. I hope he likes lemon pie." When Rosemary told the children the wedding date was set for October, the manse erupted with joy. Faith danced barefoot through the garden. Una cried. Carl carved "RM loves RM" into a tree with great ceremony. Jerry allowed himself a full smile, rare and genuine. Even Mr. Meredith seemed momentarily aware of what day it was. "Will you stay in the manse?" Faith asked a little nervously. I wouldn't dream of leaving it, Rosemary said, drawing her close. It sets my home now too. Later that evening in Rainbow Valley, the children threw a rehearsal party with a daisy crown for Rosemary, moss cake, and speeches from each of them. Do you think she's really happy? Una whispered to Walter, watching Rosemary laugh as Carl made a toast involving toads and tartlets. Walter nodded. She sits exactly where she belongs. Faith stood up, arms wide. Let it be known, she declared, that our stepmother is not wicked, not boring, and not going anywhere. Hear, hear, everyone shouted. And as the sun dipped behind the trees, Rosemary sat, surrounded by children who had once been wild and wounded and wary, and now were loved. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had softened, reshaped by belonging. Love, she realized, had not swallowed her. It had welcomed her home. Chapter 16. A New Family. The morning of the wedding dawned golden and gentle, the kind of morning Anne Blythe would one day call a memory day, a day so full of quiet beauty, it became woven into the soul. In the garden outside Ingleside, the roses were still in bloom, though tinged now with the faintest whisper of autumn. The trees, just beginning to turn, rustled softly in the breeze, as if whispering secrets to one another. And at the manse, the windows were open, letting in the scent of rosemary and sunlight, and the sounds of laughter. It was the day Rosemary West would marry John Meredith. The ceremony was to be held in the garden behind the church, under the archway of honeysuckle that Jerry and Jem had spent 3 days fortifying with wire and prayer. It was not grand. There were no pearls, no expensive gowns, no orchestra, but it was perfect. Rosemary wore a simple cream-colored dress, soft and flowing, with her hair braided and crowned with white daisies that Una had gathered at dawn. Her hands trembled a little, but her eyes were steady. She smiled when she looked at the children, who surrounded her like protective sentinels. Mr. Meredith wore his best, and slightly too short, black coat. Anne had pressed it. Walter had pinned a single wild rose to his lapel. He stood beneath the archway, looking more present, more alive than he had in years. The villagers came in full. Miss Cornelia wore a hat so wide it blocked 3 rows. Susan Baker cried discreetly into her handkerchief, and later claimed it was just the pollen. Even Ellen West was there, sitting stiffly but proudly, a lemon pie wrapped carefully in her basket for the reception. The Blythe children were there, shining and solemn. The Meredith children stood as attendants, Jerry tall and handsome, Faith fierce and glowing, Carl bursting with nervous energy, and Una quiet and radiant, holding Rosemary's hand right up to the moment she let go to step forward. And when Rosemary and John Meredith spoke their vows, clear and plain, with the hush of birdsong between their words, everything changed, and yet nothing did. After the ceremony, the guests walked to the manse for lemonade, tea, and slices of cake baked by Miss Cornelia and iced by Susan Baker with military precision. There was laughter, stories, and children darting through the garden. Mary Vance tried to steal an extra tart. Adam the rooster made a surprise appearance and was shooed off the table by Faith. In the midst of it all, Rosemary knelt beside Carl, who had grown quiet. "Are you all right?" she asked. He nodded, just thinking. About what? He looked up at her, what it feels like to have a mother again. She touched his cheek gently. "Then we sat, both lucky, because I've never had a son before either." That evening, long after the guests had gone, and the last of the lemon pie had vanished, the children gathered again in Rainbow Valley, still dressed in their wedding best, grass-stained and glowing. They lay in a circle under the trees, the soft sounds of evening wrapping around them. "It was perfect," Una said. "Everything." "I liked the cake," Carl said, "but not as much as the dancing." "You danced for 4 seconds before stepping on my foot," Faith pointed out. "Still counts," Carl said. "It does," Walter agreed. Jem folded his arms behind his head. "Now the manse isn't set just a house, it sets a real home. Do you think things will stay like this forever?" "Nothing stays the same forever," Walter said, "but some things stay inside you." "Like love?" Una asked. Walter nodded. "And places like this, and days like today." The children fell silent. The sun had gone down, leaving only starlight above and the rustling of leaves. They had been through tears and laughter, disgrace and redemption, chaos and calm, and now they were, truly and finally, a family. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew. They had found their ending, and their beginning, all in one day. Chapter 17. Farewell to Rainbow Valley. September melted into October, and the air in Glen St. Mary took on that particular crispness that whispers of endings and beginnings all at once. The maple trees flamed red and gold, leaves spinning down like slow confetti, smoke curled gently from chimneys, and children's boots began to crunch along the roads. At the manse, life had settled into something that felt finally, beautifully, whole. Rosemary, now Mrs. Meredith, moved through the household with the confident ease of someone who had stopped worrying about doing everything perfectly and started simply loving what was hers. The children, still boisterous, still themselves, had grown softer around the edges, as if someone had finally taught them how to exhale. But with that calm came a strange, unspoken realization, especially in the hearts of the children. They were changing, and so was Rainbow Valley. Faith noticed it first. One afternoon, as she ran through the winding path into the familiar hollow, she stopped short at the sight of the trees. The green was almost gone, replaced with amber and rust. The brook, once laughing and gurgling, now whispered in a slower, sleepier voice. The light itself had shifted. The valley was still beautiful, but in a quieter, more solemn way. She sat on their usual log and waited. Slowly, the others came. Anna, Walter, Carl, Nan, Dee, Jem, Jerry, even Mary Vance, though she pretended she only stopped by to see if the moss was still too squishy for walking. They all knew what it meant. They were growing older, school took more time, new chores, new books, even new thoughts had begun to stretch their attention away from make-believe kingdoms and fairy-fort hideouts. Walter was writing more poetry, Faith was talking about teaching one day, Jerry was already fixing real fences, not just imaginary ones, and Rilla, the youngest Blythe, was finally old enough to sneak after them, begging to be included. And though none of them wanted to say it, they all felt it. Rainbow Valley was beginning to say goodbye. That day, they built one last campfire in the little stone circle they'd made long ago. The flames danced, golden and flickering, lighting their faces as dusk gathered in the trees. "We should make a ceremony," Nan said suddenly. "Yes," Walter agreed. "A farewell. Not forever, but for now." So they gathered tokens. Carl placed a smooth stone, once used to mark the boundary of the Toad Palace. Anna added a pressed flower from one of her notebooks. Jem brought a feather from the hawk he'd watched all summer. Dee lifted a ribbon from her hair, faded pink. Walter added a folded poem. Mary Vance dropped in a string of beads. "Don't sept get sentimental," she warned. "But I certain miss this stupid place." Faith stood last. She didn't bring an object, just her hand, resting gently on the trunk of the old maple tree that had sheltered so many of their secrets. "We made this place," she said, "but it made us too." They all nodded. Walter read his poem aloud. "This hollow kept our growing hearts. In moss and stream and tree, and though we part, it one did depart. It lives in you and me." There were tears, laughter, and silence. Not heavy silence, but one filled with gratitude. Before they left, they buried their time tokens in a small box under the tree and placed stones on top. Carl carved their initials into the bark, carefully avoiding hurting the tree. Then they stood in a circle, just as they had when they first made their pact. "One last promise," Faith said. "That we still come back?" Day asked. "No," Faith said, "that we still remember it, even when we are too old to play here. We will carry it," Walter said softly, like a light inside. And they did, even as they walked back up the path toward home, hands brushing leaves from their sleeves, hearts a little heavy and a little full. They carried it. The brook ran behind them, quiet now. The trees stood guard. Rainbow Valley had not left them. They had simply grown beyond it. Chapter 18. Growing Up. Autumn deepened into gold and shadow. The fields in Glen St. Mary turned tawny, the hills rolled gently beneath misty skies, and the days shortened with quiet purpose. The wind changed its tune, no longer the playful breeze of summer, but something older, wiser, filled with the rustle of fallen leaves and the scent of distant wood smoke. At the manse, there was warmth and order and something more, belonging. Rosemary had woven herself into the fabric of the Meredith family, not as a thread sewn over the top, but one stitched through, deep, enduring and whole. Carl now kept his frogs outdoors. Jerry mended things without needing to be asked. Faith, still bold, still bright, began studying books on history and teaching, saying, "Maybe I'll grow up to make wild children behave. I know all the tricks." Anna, taller and more graceful every week, had taken to writing in her quiet journal with pages filled not just with thoughts but dreams. And Rainbow Valley, though visited less often, was still spoken of like an old friend present in memory, etched in heart. But the children were growing up. Walter Blythe now spent long hours in the orchard with his notebook. His words, once childish and rhymed, had deepened into something lyrical and strange. He wrote of valleys and stars, of time and truth, of sorrow he hadn't yet known, but somehow already understood. One evening, Anne found him sitting alone beneath the fir trees. "Do you feel lonely sometimes?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, "even when I sit surrounded by love." Walter nodded. "I think I sit always carry something tender with me, but I think it sits not weakness. It sits something that sees the world softer." And kissed his forehead. "Then never lose it. The world needs poets as much as it needs soldiers." At the schoolhouse, Faith surprised everyone, teachers included, by winning the end-of-term essay contest with a fiery piece titled, "Why Truth Matters Even When It Seeps Loud." Rosemary cried when she read it. Jem, always steady, was already talking about studying medicine like his father. Jerry, often quiet in the background, now stood taller. He had become the rock of the Meredith children, strong and constant, and everyone knew it. Carl saved a sparrow with a broken wing and gave it to Miss Cornelia, saying, "I think you'll like each other." Miss Cornelia, to everyone's shock, kept it. And Una, gentle, thoughtful Una, began helping Rosemary keep the manse books, her mind as neat and careful as her stitching. She no longer prayed to be better, she simply was, kind and true. One afternoon in late October, the Blythe and Meredith children took one last walk together before the weather turned. They wandered not to Rainbow Valley, but along the ridge, where the harbor shimmered in the distance, and the wind tugged at their sleeves like a reminder. "It's going to snow soon," Dee said, clutching her hat. "Feels like something's ending," Una whispered. "Or beginning," Walter said. Faith tilted her chin to the sky. "We start not children anymore. We'll always be something to each other," Jem replied. "Even if we change," Nan added, "we came from the same stories." They walked in silence after that, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, and when they reached the top of the ridge, they stood looking out at their little world, Glun St. Mary, Ingleside, the manse, and somewhere beyond the trees, the hidden heart of Rainbow Valley. No one suggested going back to the valley that day. They didn't need to. It had already followed them, in their steps, in their hearts. And so the story settled, not in a neat conclusion, but in a feeling. A sense that growing up did not mean leaving everything behind, that the magic of childhood could live on, not just in memory, but in how they loved, how they forgave, how they belonged. The Meredith children were no longer ragamuffins and whispers of scandal. They were part of something, of a village, a family, a future. And Rainbow Valley, tucked away beyond the manse, would always wait, quiet, patient, full of sunlight and shadow and the echoes of laughter. It was the place they came from, and wherever they went, it would go too. The end. Thanks for spending this quiet time with me here at Sweet Dreams Storytelling. I hope you're feeling relaxed, peaceful, and ready for a restful sleep. As we say goodnight, let the calm background music guide you gently into dreamland. Before you go, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and until next time, rest well.